Host Christine Marie, and I am excited to talk tonight about the spiritual intelligence. On Sundays, we talk about this other intelligence that each one of us has. Um, the spiritual is something that is often conflated with religion, and so often we actually don't actually take the time to. I kind of like the concept of almost like divorcing the two, really understanding what is the difference between religion versus spiritual, because and I'm not talking about when someone asks, what do you believe, and you're like, oh well, I don't necessarily believe anything, but I'm spiritual. I'm talking about the actual part of our being, much so like our intellectual and our emotional centers that need to be activated and turned on, that we derive intelligence from. So our intellectual intelligence has been cultivated since we were in kindergarten, even earlier, but technically intentionally cultivated through education. And then the EQ, the emotional intelligence, is something that we're really more recently talking about in a very intentional way. Just this week, I moderated a webinar between two experts from Harvard, and both of them, part of their job is to go into organizations and help leaders cultivate the emotional intelligence. They actually are really, one of them is my client, and he really delves into, he's got a psychiatrist and therapeutic background, and so he's really able to help them understand how the past really shows up in the present. No leader is unaffected and unimpacted by their childhood and by their past. And so, to the degree to which we have not processed the past, it plays a part in our subconscious mind in the way that we lead. And he was talking about how effectively the health of the leader very much so impacts the health of the organization, primarily internally, but also the way that we show up with our customers. Because when we think about it, we are at the nucleus. We, as the leaders, especially if we own the business, we're at the nucleus, and everything trends out from that. Think of concentric circles. You and I are at the very nucleus of every part of our lives, not just business, but also our families. And so when we think and talk about the spiritual intelligence, it's a core part of us that every single person has. And the way that I kind of like to think about the spiritual intelligence is when we have this inner knowing, so to say, when it's like, I have no idea how I know that, but it almost feels like it was told to me, it was revealed to me. I would have no explanation other than somehow I know. And that's when I say spiritual intelligence, that's what I'm talking about, is activating and turning on and awakening this part of every single one of us that effectively makes us human. But we don't really spend much time with that, and rather we confuse that part of us that is innate in every single one of us with religion, which is technically something external. It is a belief system. It is a entity in and of itself that we choose to perhaps adhere to, develop practices around. Maybe even there's core principles in there that we decide to adopt and integrate with ourselves. But the emotional intelligence, the intellectual intelligence, the spiritual intelligence, all of those are the inner being, the inner self. And with that, it changes and kind of flips everything on its head, because when we actually recognize that there is a desperate need to awaken our spirit, it allows for there to be this element of radical responsibility for you and me when it comes to engaging with religion or really any belief system in the external world, of how does my spirit actually engage with said belief system. And the reason why this is so important is because growing up in a very Christian conservative environment, I have seen many people stay very strictly, if not perhaps even more so, adherent to the belief systems which I was raised in. And I've seen others go the complete opposite direction and completely, like, not just disregard, but actually go on the other extreme where they're so anti-religion, and it's not founded in much else other than a trauma response. It's like I hate how I was raised so much to the degree that I hate that belief system for no other reason than I hate how I was so controlled by it. But there hasn't been an element of activation of the spiritual part of them to thus form an intelligent reason and why. We talked about this yesterday, of the importance of having a why that grounds us, that is a propelling force. And so if we have a why that is solely predicated in reaction rather than a why that is proactive, that's in alignment with a target that we have set ourselves, of this is who I want to be, this is how I want to live, this is what I want to cultivate in each one of my intelligences, this is where I'm going. That is a proactive type of living and type of activation of each one of these intelligences to get to this end goal, rather than the why being the fueling energy that propels us forward out of a reactive type of response to something we hated in our life. And so that's where tonight I just want to kind of start off with this challenge of, with the spiritual pursuits in your life and in my life, how many of them are reactive, fueled by this reactive response to the past, or fueled with a proactive, clear, delineated direction based on the ideal for who I want to be? And then how then do I engage? So that's kind of question number one. And then question number two is, okay, well, what does that look like? What is the actual practices that I can put in place based on the principles that I am intentionally pursuing, not just running away from? So with that kind of concept of the reactive sort of living, it's like a running away from something rather than a running towards, with a proactive intentional design. And so with even that, first question, am I being proactive or reactive with my spirituality? I think perhaps the even greater question is, do I even know my target? And having a target that is just, well, I don't want to be like that, is not enough, because what we will end up doing is doing a whole 360 and return to that which we know. And when I say return to that which we know, it doesn't mean that we'll perhaps be believing the same thing per se, but it could be a similar type of, and I'll say spirit, because the dogmatic, black and white, binary type of thinking can show up whether you're in the church or hating the church. That same kind of spirit guiding those two kind of belief systems can show up in any regard. And so the element of, well, I'm going to remove myself reactively and hate on this structure is not enough to get to the root problems of what it is that we could actually really be activated by it, and really being having a strong reaction to. I'm thinking specifically of a dear friend of mine who just was so wounded growing up in that type of environment. Like, really, there was abuse, there was appropriated distribution of power and control, and it was so devastating for her. And so thinking about her specifically, in one sense, it makes so much it makes so much sense, given her nervous system and how her body and mind and spirit, everything is reacting in terms of a trauma response to a traumatic inciting event and just environment in general. So it makes sense that she would be living in reaction. But in order to get to the other side and actually take control of your life, there's something in the identification of in the identification of what were the real systems that I'm actually fighting against. It's not just that environment of church. It's not just because there are other churches that can have a healthy manifestation, just like if it's, there are different synagogues and different temples and things like that, where some are run by a controlling essence and some are just, this is where we come to practice worship, and it's almost very benign in terms of a controlling element in the environment. And so when it comes to something in our past that we feel like we need to heal from in a religious context, something external that we entered into in a religious environment, what are those things that were really the root at the root that we need to heal from. And y'all, without actually identifying that, there will constantly, in our subconscious mind and even our physical body, we will be having misattribution of pain and misattribution of this reaction that is so big and so strong. And there's no way for us to ever really be able to heal that trauma response, because it's not just the church building or not just the temple or not just the pastor. It's at the core root. It could be the controlling element that really took over maybe your family household, translated down from the pulpit down into your home. Or maybe it was the binary black and white thinking and the refusal to be open and see the world with the color and kind of grayness that it is. And there's just such an importance to get to the root of why. Why was that so difficult or traumatizing? Or why does that make you so angry? At past knowing retreats, in terms of really kind of pursuing this question, and not even just this question, but more broadly in helping us understand what our values are, specifically as it pertains to spirituality. The question of, well, what makes you angry and why, can really unveil a value. And often that's rooted in a story or a specific experience. And so by us traversing the path back to childhood or early adolescence or adulthood, and identifying these core moments as it pertains to spirituality, were really damaging. And okay, now that I have identified the root and the actual element of why it activates me, why control is a problem, why binary thinking really bothers me. Okay, well, now what's my new target? Because that, apart from addressing that, we will that's what we will effectively come back and do a 360 on, because it's in us. It's a root. It's there. We hated it out there, but so often we hate that which is a mirror for us. And y'all, this is so hard. I was talking with a friend about this today. This is such a hard truth to grapple with. The things that we can judge most harshly in others often can be a mirror for that which is most true in us. And so if I am seeing someone else who is binary and black and white, there's probably a really good chance that I am struggling with that too, perhaps in a different regard. And even today, in talking with my friend, they reflected something to me, and I sat with that and I was like, oh, that's a real hard one. And so I sat with it and thanked them for their feedback. And about 10 minutes later, I was like, I think I have something to share that I don't think you're going to like. And they're like, okay, let's hear it. And I was like, that thing that you called out in me? And they're like, yeah. I was like, I think you do that too. And they were like, dang it, you're right. Like, it was like, oh gosh. And y'all, that's the thing. That's the beauty of relationship, is that we get to be mirrors for each other and we get to grow together. But if we're not willing to look in the mirror, whether it's an institution or an individual, that is going to reflect in us our values, things that we need to grow in, areas perhaps even of, if it's unjust, that's revealing a value to me of something that it really, really matters. And maybe the root is because, and this is a hard one. So I'm going to use a different example other than justice. Emotional intelligence has become a value for me. It's a deep, massive value, because my life fell apart as a result of the lack of emotional intelligence and the lack of emotional health. And so when I encounter people who are not emotionally healthy, I can feel my hackles raise at times. One, because they can be a mirror for me of how I have been in the past. It can be a mirror of, oh, I'm actually afraid. I feel fear right now that I might become that again. It can also be a mirror for me of, oh man, that's a value. So it can, when people, whether it's an individual or an institution, it can be a mirror reflecting our fears, our values, or that which needs to be healed and addressed. And so when we are willing to look back on our religious, spiritual experiences with that lens, of how is this reflecting a fear in me, a value in me, or a growth area for me, man, all of a sudden there's so much freedom and so much forgiveness. There's opportunity for forgiveness. If we're willing to allow for almost like I don't know, I just had this thought like the lid of the box to come off, and like all of a sudden it's not about who's right and wrong. I'm not analyzing the past to be like, see, look what you did. It's well, what can I learn about me? What can I learn about what I care about today? And how can I use that past to inform the potential that I get to potentially walk into should I so choose? And with the potential, it's, oh man, I actually have this fear in me. I actually want to change that. I don't want to be operating in fear. I don't want to be reactive when it comes to spirituality. I want to be proactive, walking towards this ideal. And the question that I kind of posed tonight, or rather concept, is exactly what my friend and I were talking about tonight. Don't let anything be the center of your orbit other than the superordinate principle that calls you higher. Y'all, organizing our thoughts, opinions, beliefs, pathways as it pertains to spiritual intelligence as a reactive source to pain in the past is never going to take us higher. It is only ever going to keep us at a level playing field, if not going down in terms of our own potential and potency and prowess. Like we're going to be staying at a level or heading downwards. Y'all, this is so important that when we think about our ideal, our targets that we're setting for ourselves, it's so easy to say, oh, I want to grow in this way professionally. I want to grow in this way as insert a role, right? Whether that's being a mom, I want to grow in being a mother in this regard. But in terms of spirituality, how do I want to cultivate my ability to attune to the voice of God, to love better, to be able to forgive, to be able to attend to the wounds in me that are in alignment with something far greater that calls me to be better, to reach higher heights, rather than just living with this like pesky past that is constantly annoying us, that we're constantly having to shoo away. And yeah, the way I grew up, man, that was some kind of cult, like just so much, man, so much negativity. And it's just so, it brings us down. This is why I really love what David Hawkins, he wrote this book called Letting Go, among many, many others, and he assigns numerical value to different emotional states. And this emotional state of pride, emotional state of ego, emotional state of shame, y'all, when we're in these kind of lesser emotional numerical value frequencies, there's a lower energy and frequency at which we operate in. And so if I'm constantly living like, ugh, you should hear about this traumatic childhood experience I had with the church, man, that just brings everything down, rather than, because I grew up the way that I did, I care so much about community and not controlling my environment. And I'm so excited to create dinners and making Sundays full of rest and encouragement, and creating an environment that is with like-minded people, that brings life and joy and freedom and hope to myself, my family, and those around me, rather than going and being in an environment that's controlling. But it's like, what are we where we place our attention is where we place our energy. Dr. Joe Dispenza said that, and that really impacted me when I heard that a couple months ago. Where you place your attention is where you place your energy. So where am I placing my attention when it comes to spirituality? Am I focusing on how much beauty there is in terms of the spiritual pursuits of pursuing these higher emotional frequencies of courage and peace and joy and learning new things? I feel like over the last year and a half, my box that I had put God in has just completely blown open again and again and again and again. And so if I have as the center of my orbit all these horror stories of the past, of man, you should hear the cult I was raised in. And I hear that a lot when it comes to people who have had a bad experience from religion. But if we've got at the center of our orbit, rather than the past, we've got a new target, a new ideal. And we're like, man, I'm creating something. That is us stepping into our power. That's us having a why that fuels us forward, being proactive towards a new outcome, towards a new future, towards a new ideal, rather than not addressing. And this is really important, y'all. Just changing our environment is not enough. We have to change at the heart, at the root, these things that have been truly systemic, not just in the environment, but for generations. There's a reason why there's patterns in families, and we see it over and over and over again. Even though they can live in another country, another state, one might be religious, one generation may not be, but it's the systemic core issues that if they remain unaddressed, it doesn't matter how much they attend church or not. It doesn't matter how much they actually pray and seek God. If they're not addressing those core issues in them and uprooting them and then planting something new, they're going to see the same disease generationally passed on. And so this is where, when we analyze and consider parts of our past that we don't like, we have to get at the core. Because just like how we are the nucleus of the concentric circles of our lives, the spiritual, emotional, and even physical parts of us are at the nucleus of all of our behaviors, all of our beliefs even. And so we have to take account and radical responsibility to analyze the core elements that were handed to us, whether from the pastor, pope, priest, parent, anything that was handed to us since honestly, this is even important to analyze, what was the environment in which I was born into? Was there peace? Was there conflict and strife? Because this gentleman I heard, I was listening to a podcast, and he shared this story about when he was 6 months old. He was in a car, in his car seat, and his parents tell him the story. He doesn't remember. But when he was 6 months old, he all of a sudden just stopped breathing. And his parents pulled over the car and gave him the Heimlich, and he effectively died for I think it was a couple minutes. Then he came back, which was, thank God. But ever since then, he's always wondered, why do I just feel my body tense every time I'm in the car, buckled in? And it's because his body remembers being 6 months old, having this happen. Our body remembers, and our emotions and our spirit, every part of us remembers, unless we go back and deal with the root issue. So if there are systemic elements that have been passed down to us or that we experienced in childhood, specifically as it pertains to an external religious environment, it likely made its way inside. So us changing the environment is not enough. We have to address the systemic issues. And how can we allow for the institutions and the individuals around us to serve as mirrors to reflect our fears and values and areas for growth and healing? And then that's where we actually really start experiencing not just freedom, but we allow for true creation. We allow for true, man, like I said, the last year and a half, the box that I put God in has just blown apart. All of a sudden now it's dreaming and creating this new type of man, intelligence around what's possible spiritually, because now we're co-creating with God. Guys, if we're made in his image, then we are the greatest creators out there. And we need to, man, this is what's so exciting. Once we allow for all of those kind of preconceived, limiting structures that were handed to us, passed down from our parents or the podium from childhood, and we allow for us to kind of start fresh and be like, okay, well, what do I believe? What has been revealed to me? Y'all, God has so much to say to you and to me so that we can create something unique, something that has never been seen before, and allow for healing to be through us. Through divine revelation, we get to be the co-conspirators and co-creators with the divine himself. And that is so much of the goal of going back and healing from those moments in childhood with specifically religion, that are so important, because only then on the other side do we experience freedom in the present and ability to create for the future. And y'all, there's a lot that needs to be created, because there's a lot of pain that needs to be addressed. And as we, this has been so true in my life. And even on Thursday, when I hosted the Foundations of Knowing along with 𝐤𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲, his whole, a lot of people in his community showed up. And one of the things that we addressed was that as we deal with our pain, so much of the time, our very life's purpose lies within that pain. And then someone said, our mess becomes our message. And I just love that concept. So by us being brave enough, and this is where I love Hawkins' concept of the numerical values associated with different energy levels. If we're stuck in ego or stuck in shame or stuck in pride, all of that is below the energy level of courage. But if we're courageous enough to go and address the pain, as we address it, we therein might find the very purpose for our lives and what we were created to create. And so with that, y'all, I would love to hear what's on your heart and your mind, specifically as I'm looking at this week. I've got a couple guests coming on the Knowing Show. I would love to hear if there's specific topics on your mind. The other week I heard from someone, and it was really, really helpful and actually informed one of the show's directions. So I'd love to hear from you on what's on your mind. I am going to be hosting another Foundations of Knowing workshop, because a lot of folks weren't able to make it. And so rather than just sending the replay, I'd love to do it live, because there's some exercises that we move through in real time and I get to answer people's questions. And also on the replay, just people share private stuff. And so I don't want to air their stories and their mess and their messages without permission. So I'm going to be hosting it again on the 6th, Thursday, noon Eastern. So I think this Thursday. Oh my gosh, y'all, happy November. What the heck? That's crazy. So I'll be hosting a kind of a repeat of the Foundations of Knowing workshop this Thursday. Send me a DM if you would like to participate in that. And then we'll be joining on Thursday for that. And then I will be, honestly, we didn't get through the whole workshop. So we'll be doing the second part of the Foundations of Knowing, which is specifically around, how does the work that we did in the first part of the workshop, which is understanding our core stories and the impact they have today, how can we actually alchemize those to use them in our brand and in the building of them? Y'all, one time I was speaking on stage and I said, everybody raise your hand who has a proprietary brand, and probably a quarter of the room raised their hand. And by the end of the conversation, everyone agreed that every single one of them has a proprietary brand, because no one else has their unique experience, unique story, and unique call to create. And so for that reason, every single person needs to understand what their brand is, because that is our core radical responsibility to be a good steward. And y'all, that's our brand, our proprietary brand is probably our greatest asset right now, especially with AI coming in and jobs changing and being called into question. And it's like, what is happening? Where's the future going? We need to cultivate our personal brands. This is probably one of the most important things you and I can do over the next 12 to 24 months as we're watching the world change. And so I invite you to join me on Thursday, November 6th at noon Eastern. And then otherwise we'll be kind of back on the regular schedule of the part 2 of the Foundations of Knowing on November 20th, noon Eastern. And then we'll be doing a repeat of that event. And then December 18th, we'll be getting into strategic alignment, really allowing for how do we actually live out, now that we kind of have done the work to know some core tenets of who we are, how that manifests in our brand specifically, how does that impact our relationships in the way that we actually truly show up? I've seen so many times, time and time again, it's most devastating with folks in the church where on Sundays, there's just this really beautiful person you encounter, but then the rest of the week, they're a little hell-bent people. And so it's so sad when we have this disparity, and y'all, all of us are guilty of it apart from being able to set up the practices that will protect us to ensure that we show up in alignment with who we say we want to be every day, who we're created to be every day. And so really that strategic alignment conversation that's going to take place on December 18th, that's so important. How do we actually live in alignment with this subordinate principle that we've identified in our lives, that is our ideal, that ultimately is the fueling source that guides us so that we live proactively in alignment with something that at the end of our life we'll look back on and truly be proud of. So those are some dates coming up. I will share more over the next couple of days, but send me a DM if you want to